Welcome to the Sunday Night Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. You're here with me this last day in May 2020. We're going to spend the next 2 hours together. Well, you signed up to receive our weekly rundown of topics. It's been a little chaotic. All of a sudden, I can't make it work, and I don't know why. I can't get the words to come out straight on the page, and they're coming out on the second page, which I don't do. I do the first page, but it's showing up on the second page. So sometime this week, I've got to figure out how to make that work. But I only send this out once a week, let you know what the topics are going to be. If I can't get it resolved, I'm probably not going to do it. But if you'd like to know what's going on, just shoot me an email. Email thebibleforum@gmail.com. Tell me what you're looking for, and we'll respond to it. No other email is sent from the Bible. We don't harass people with stuff like this. Just try to keep everybody that wants to know in the know. We have a number of things that are happening around the world and around our country relative to this coronavirus thing. The coronavirus news has taken front page at the Bible Forum the last several weeks and is not yet done. What we're being told is if the masks work, then why are we told to engage in social distancing? Why can't we be close together if the masks work? If social distancing works, why are we wearing the masks? If the masks and the social distancing work, why are we got a lot of businesses closed? If we can stand in line at the grocery store, why can't we stand in line to vote? Oh, well, that's an easy answer. The answer is because it's not about the virus. It never was. Last week, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention published guidance that suggested COVID-19 was not easily transmitted on surfaces. Friday of this week, the CDC changed that guidance somewhat. What they said was COVID-19, quote, does not spread easily from touching surfaces or objects. That put it in the same category as animal to human transmission. Previous CDC guidance had said that COVID-19 survives on some surfaces and will do so for some amount of days. But now the CDC is saying, quote, after media reports appeared that suggested a change in CDC's view on transmissibility, it became clear that these edits were confusing. It may be possible to contract COVID-19 simply by touching a contaminated surface and then touching your eyes, your nose, or your mouth. I say stay tuned. It's probably going to change again. In a Wednesday interview with CNN's Newsroom, Dr. Fauci, member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force, said that a second COVID-19 wave is not necessarily inevitable. That's a change from last month. He says we often talk about the possibility of a second wave or an outbreak when we are in the process of reopening. We don't have to accept that as an inevitability, however. Particularly, he continued, when people start thinking about the fall of the year. I want people to really appreciate that it could happen, but that it's not inevitable. Fauci went on to admit that he is beginning to feel more and more optimistic as the days go by, insists that the U.S.'s expanded capability for testing is bolstering the COVID-19 response. He pointed out that a second wave is entirely preventable if the United States is able to have the workforce system and the will to do the kinds of things that are clear and effective identification, isolation, and contact tracing. The inquiring minds want to know what happened here. In April, Fauci insisted that second wave of coronavirus was inevitable. Apparently this was a scientific reality. He is certain the virus will return in the fall, and that we should all wear masks, even though later in the interview he admitted the masks are more a gesture for other people than a medical necessity. The masks apparently show respect for other people. That's kind of the way I viewed it from the beginning, but I'm not a scientist. However, I still hold my same position. If you're a scientist, I guess you keep moving. I don't know. I don't get it. I ran across a little saying, I guess. It's entitled, "What Hath Coronavirus Wrought?" I can't remember where I got it. But someone wrote, "For many years there have been those few people who have warned the United States, amongst a host of other countries, that we are headed inexorably toward a state of tyranny, and that those who value their freedom would be advised to get out of Dodge." Accompanying the warning has often been a suggestion as to timing. The old saw that it's better to be a year too early than a day too late encourages the early selection of a suitable new country of residence, along with the procurement of premises and the movement of assets, as these take time to put into place. It's therefore advisable to have the new residence in place well in advance. That, in the case of the U.S., is no longer possible. The well in advance option has already expired. Isn't it all theoretical as to whether a state of tyranny is in the offing? The answer to that question is a decided no. The coronavirus is presently being used by the powers that be, the powers that remove one freedom from another. And while some people vainly hope that once the virus has subsided, freedoms will return, that notion is quite mistaken. The White House's virus guru, Anthony Fauci, has stated that the world will never return to what is considered normal before the coronavirus. This notion that Corona-19 or COVID-19 will be the virus that never goes away has been supported by a fanciful chart created by the Gates Foundation and funded by the Imperial College of London. It suggests that, like clockwork, every 3 months for the next 18 months, COVID-19 will return for a series of encores, making it necessary for the government to, once again, clamp down on freedoms in order to, quote, keep the nation safe, end of quote. Of course, no virus has ever behaved in this manner before, yet under this notion, the globalists are really coming out of the woodwork, announcing an ever-growing number of new controls to cope with the anticipated encores. Perhaps the most disturbing of these is the planned introduction of a federally funded tracking system for all citizens. A tracking system to determine their locations 24/7 and to track their behavior. Those monitoring the system will then calculate personal risk scores. Those with insufficient scores will be quarantined and denied employment. In addition, sufficient scores will be necessary in order to be allowed to travel, not only to other countries, but locations like your neighborhood grocery store. If all this sounds familiar, it should. It's the Orwellian system that China relies on to control the movements of its people. The system has been described in the U.S. as being especially necessary to control those who may refuse vaccination. After all, for those who use their constitutional right to decline to be vaccinated, a suitable punishment must exist, and that punishment will be a further loss of essential freedoms. So what sort of time frame are they looking at here? Well, researchers hope to have a working app in place by August of this year, 2020, with vaccines possibly coming later. Of course, we cannot, be certain that this will be in place by August, only that this is the operative date. From that date forward, it would be advisable to presume that a tracking system will be in place and that personal risk scores will be in use. At any time after August, it will be uncertain as to whether a given individual will be allowed the privilege to earn a living, that they would be allowed the privilege to socialize or to travel. We cannot be certain, they tell us, that any specific individual will be refused the choice to get out of Dodge, but we can be certain that in the future this will no longer be a right. This will become a privilege that will either be allowed or not, depending on the decisions of a faceless bureaucracy to whom it may or may not be possible to appeal. For those who live in any country where the laws are becoming ever more draconian, this plan may serve as a warning that it might be a good time to plan a move to a country where the government is not contemplating such measures. However, in the United States, the country that is now leading the way toward a more totalitarian state, those who value their freedom may choose to pick up sticks and beat a hasty exit out the window, since that window may soon be closing. Now, logically, the ripple effects of the global pandemic are only starting to take shape. The consequences of shutting down the economy, printing unprecedented amounts of money, could be crippling to the average person, particularly savers, retirees, and investors. Further, governments have granted themselves all sorts of new powers. The devastating impact on personal freedom and liberty will be long-lasting. We will learn about the new powers only as we run afoul of them. The mainstream media is ignoring the fact that the CDC has admitted the death rate for the COVID-19 is actually lower than the flu. This is happening as the media admits that the antibody tests are wrong 50% of the time. How do we know all this? Well, the CDC just came out with a report that should be earth-shattering to the narrative of the political class, yet will no doubt go into the thick pile of vital data and information about the virus that's not getting out to the public. But for the first time, the CDC has attempted to offer a real estimate of the overall death rate for COVID-19, and under its most likely scenario, that number is 0.26%, about 25, 1/4. Until now, we have been ridiculed for thinking the death rate was that low, as opposed to the 3.4% estimate of the World Health Organization, an organization that helped drive the panic and the lockdowns. Now the CDC is agreeing to the lower rate in plain ink. Plus, ultimately, we might find out that the IFR is even lower, because numerous studies and hard counts of confined populations have shown a much higher percentage of asymptomatic cases. Simply adjusting for a 50% asymptomatic rate would drop the fatality rate to 0.2%, exactly the rate of fatality Dr. John Lonitis of Stanford University projected a while back. More importantly, as mentioned before, the overall death rate is meaningless because the numbers are so lopsided. Given that at least half the deaths were in nursing homes, a back-of-the-envelope estimate would show that the infection fatality rate for non-nursing home residents would be only 0.1%, or 1 out of every 1,000 people to contract this virus. And that includes people of all ages, all health statuses, at least those outside of nursing homes. Since nearly all of the deaths are those with what are called comorbidities, we have all of these numbers being reevaluated. And the information is coming from the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Keep in mind, this is something most people have known relatively early on as the government continued to inflate the numbers and call every death a COVID-19 casualty so they could commit economic terrorism on the entire planet. And those antibody tests the ruling class wants us all to take before we can even think about coming off house arrest, those are only right half the time. Once we establish coronavirus as public enemy number one, we can then go after climate emergency. Every crisis from now on will be presented as an emergency, dwarfing the last emergency, and anybody who disagrees or presents refuting data will be deplatformed as misinformation and dismissed as conspiracy nuts. But each one will move us toward the holy grail of progressivism, a government knows best technocracy that forces equality on everyone, or else. The new normal is here to stay. For starters, it means we now live in a centrally planned economy for real. Over these last few years, with the unprecedented level of intervention in markets and interest rates, numerous prognosticators have warned that market signaling has been destroyed and we were headed for central planning. This would be a bad thing because every centrally planned economy throughout history has ended in humiliation and failure. But make no mistake, we are in one now. If the stock market goes down, central banks make them go back up using interest rate cuts and quantitative easing. If the bond market wobbles, the Fed starts buying bonds, even junk bonds, to stabilize it. Most of all, governments worldwide shut down the entire economy simply by decree and only allow businesses deemed to be essential to remain open or to operate. In order for a centrally planned economy to work, however, you need total control over the population and the ability to monitor every aspect of it. So I think we will see the war on cash intensify under the pretense that physical notes spread infection. We'll see China-style social credit systems under the guise of immunity passports and contact tracking, which are already being discussed in past tense as something that cannot but be accomplished. At some point over a few short months, the response by nation states and the World Health Organization to a comparatively lightweight pandemic, meaning in terms of case fatalities without underlying comorbidity factors, has transitioned from being typically ham-fisted and inept into operant conditioning of the masses in order to inculcate them to a state of learned helplessness. Take everything you thought you believed about self-reliance, industriousness, thrift, personal responsibility, entrepreneurship, or just pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, and flush it down the toilet. It's all becoming meaningless because now the only thing that matters is what the government thinks about your business. Should your business be permitted to operate? Do you have the green light to collect rent from your tenants on property you own? Or will you have to first comply with some social justice rental quotas? Give your tenants an equity stake in your properties. Oh, and that proposal has already been floated for landlords seeking emergency relief. It portends the type of egalitarian, that means every citizen has an equal right and equal share initiative, will be inundated with we will be inundated with all of this under a democratic socialism. I'm 77 years old. I hope I don't live to see it. The CDC estimates that as of May 18 this year, 2020, approximately 90,000 Americans have died of COVID-19. I heard today that number is 100,000. Adjusted for population size, that comes out to a mortality rate of 272 deaths per million. That doesn't sound as bad, does it? No. This is, so far, less than half the mortality rate for the 1957-58 flu pandemic. You remember that one, don't you? I lived through it. I don't remember it. Not sure anybody talked about it much. In that pandemic, it is estimated that as many as 116,000 Americans died. Yet the U.S. population was much smaller then, totaling only 175 million. So adjusted for population size, mortality as a result of the Asian flu pandemic of the 57-58 was more like 660 per million. Are you making a note of any of these numbers? You remember what I just told you was the number for us? It was like a third of that, wasn't it? It's an amazing thing. 272. Back then, over 660. 3 times. That's the equivalent of 220,000 deaths in the United States today. Yet Americans in 1957 did not respond by shutting down commerce, forcing people into lockdown, or driving unemployment up to Depression-era levels. In fact, reports show that Americans took little action beyond the usual measures involved in trying to slow the spread of a disease. Make sure you wash your hands, stay home when you're sick. Although the virus does appear to have been a factor in the 1958 recession, the economic effects were minuscule compared to what the U.S. now faces from the reaction to COVID-19. This suggests that most of the economic damage now being experienced by workers and households in the United States is more a product of the policy reaction to the virus than to the virus itself. Reality? Overall, the economy declined by approximately 2% during both the first and second quarters of 1958. But not all of that can be attributed to the virus. Unemployment at the time was also surged, peaking at 7.5% in July of 1958. Economic growth was positive again, however, by the fourth quarter of 58, and it soared to over 9% in 1959. Unemployment had fallen to 5% by June of that year. The overall economic impact of the virus itself was hardly disastrous. The 1918-19 pandemic, which caused an astounding 10 times as many deaths per million as the 57-58 pandemic, also failed to produce economic disaster. Although the United States entered the 1918-19 pandemic in poor economic shape thanks to the Great War, according to economists Ephraim Ben Melech and Carola Friedman, the Spanish flu left almost no discernible mark on the aggregate U.S. economy. According to some estimates, real gross national product actually grew in 1919, a mere 1%, however. In New York, in 2020, most indicators of aggregate economic activity suffers modestly so far. And those that did decline more significantly right after the influenza outbreak, like industrial output, recovered within months. Nor can the pandemic be blamed for the 1921 recession, because by then the decline in output had all to do with the collapse of commodity prices when post-war European production finally recovered. Needless to say, the economy today appears to be in far worse shape in the wake of the 2020 pandemic than in the days following the 57-58 outbreak or even in 1919. As of April 2020, the unemployment rate has ballooned to 14.4%, the highest rate recorded since the Great Depression. The Atlanta Federal Reserve, meanwhile, forecasts a drop in GDP of more than 40%, 40%. More mild estimates suggest drops of 8 to 15%. If the milder predictions prove true, then the current downturn is only the worst since the Great Depression. If the Atlanta Fed is right, then we are in unprecedented, uncharted economic waters. And why? Because we shut down.